Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I still remember that crisp Saturday afternoon in our little slice of Ohio suburbia, where the leaves were turning those vibrant shades of gold and red that always made me think new beginnings were possible. Even as I fussed over the final touches for Ethan's 10th birthday party, hanging streamers from the oak tree in the backyard and arranging the picnic table with platitudes of balloons, a homemade cake frosted in his favorite blue, and platters of hot dogs, chips, and fruit skewers that I'd spent the morning preparing because I wanted this day to feel special for him after all the letdowns we'd weathered since the divorce, inviting not just Mike's parents and his sister Karen with her 2 kids who lived only 20 minutes away, but also the neighbors like the Millers next door who waved every morning and promised they'd swing by with a gift, figuring that with enough planning and positive energy, this could be the event that bridged the gaps in our fractured family and showed Ethan that people still cared about the quiet milestones in his life. As the clock ticked toward 3 in the afternoon, the time I'd set for everyone to arrive, I watched from the kitchen window with a mix of excitement and that underlying nervousness that came from past no-shows. Like the Christmas where Mike's mom Evelyn sent regrets via text about a sudden headache while posting photos of their holiday feast online, but I pushed it aside, calling out to Ethan in the living room where he was practicing his soccer tricks on the rug, telling him to get ready. Because the backyard was about to turn into the best party spot in the neighborhood, his grin wide and trusting as he dashed outside to inflate a few more balloons with the helium tank I'd splurged on. The kind of innocent enthusiasm that made every effort feel worthwhile despite the tight budget from my library job and the alimony scraps Mike occasionally remembered to send. By 4, with the sun warming the grass and music playing softly from the Bluetooth speaker, I started glancing at my phone for updates, replying to a thumbs-up emoji from Karen that morning with a reminder of the address just in case. But as 5 rolled around and the yard remained eerily empty save for the 2 of us tossing a frisbee to pass the time, a subtle shift happened in the air, the kind that turns hope into quiet dread. Ethan asking if maybe Daddy was coming with Tommy for a surprise while I forced a smile and suggested everyone was probably just running late from errands or traffic on the interstate, though deep down I knew from experience that Mike's family had a talent for prioritizing their own schedules over ours. Like the school play last spring where they claimed a conflict but later admitted on social media it was a golf outing instead. The disappointment settled in gradually as the afternoon stretched into evening, the cake untouched on its stand and the juice boxes sweating in the cooler, Ethan trying to keep up the fun by organizing an impromptu treasure hunt with candy I'd hidden around the fence line, his laughter echoing a bit too forced while I grilled a few burgers just for us, the smoke curling up like unanswered questions. And by 7, when the sky deepened to twilight and not a single car had pulled into the driveway, we both acknowledged the elephant in the empty yard, sitting on the porch steps with paper plates of cooling food, him picking at his meal and me wrapping an arm around his shoulders, whispering that real celebrations were about the people who showed up no matter what, even if today it was just his mom who wouldn't let him down. That night, after tucking him into bed with extra chapters from his favorite adventure book to drown out the silence, I wandered back to the backyard under the porch light, the streamers limp in the breeze and those helium balloons sagging against the fence like forgotten promises, deflating overnight into wrinkled skins that mirrored the ache in my chest, cleaning up alone with a broom and trash bags while replaying the day's quiet failure, not just anger at Mike for skipping out again as he had for months with excuses about work down in Cincinnati, but a deeper frustration with his whole side of the family who lived close enough to smell the grill yet treated our home like an inconvenient footnote in their lives, their morning texts full of enthusiasm that evaporated without a trace, leaving me to wonder how a boy as sweet as Ethan could be so easily overlooked by blood relatives who preached family values at every holiday card. The following days blurred into a routine shadowed by that letdown, Monday morning dropping him at school with pep talks about resilience drawn from my own single mom survival stories, while I buried myself in cataloging returns at the library to avoid dwelling on the stack of bills that seemed to multiply like the regrets, scrolling through my messages during lunch for any belated apologies and finding only radio silence, which stung worse than outright rudeness because it confirmed we weren't even worth the effort of an excuse. By Tuesday evening, as Ethan sketched pictures at the dinner table of imaginary crowds cheering for his birthday, filling in details with crayons to make up for what didn't happen, I felt that familiar resolve hardening inside me. The kind forged from 2 years of co-parenting battles where Mike painted me as the obstacle in court while vanishing when it came to showing up, and just as I was rinsing dishes with the water running hot over my hands, my phone buzzed on the counter with a notification from him, the ex-husband whose face I hadn't seen in person since the last custody drop-off, the message popping up casual and entitled as ever, "Hey Sarah, hope things are good up there. Lisa's planning a big bash for Tommy's high school graduation next month. It's gonna be special for the family. Can you chip in $2,200? Need to lock in the venue soon. Thanks." Staring at those words on the screen, my grip tightening on the sponge until suds dripped onto the floor, a surge of incredulity mixed with rage washed over me. Because here he was demanding a small fortune for his Golden Boys milestone event, as if Ethan's empty party hadn't just unfolded under our roof, treating me like an ATM for his perfect family narrative while ignoring the one we'd built from scraps. My fingers itching to respond, but pausing as the full weight of his audacity settled in, hinting at layers of selfishness I hadn't fully confronted yet. Staring at Mike's text message glowing on my phone screen that Tuesday evening with the kitchen sink still running hot over the soapy dishes and the faint sound of Ethan's television show drifting from the living room where he was unwinding after homework, I felt a bizarre mix of disbelief and dark amusement bubbling up inside me, because after the sting of his family's complete absence from Ethan's birthday just days earlier, complete with those sagging balloons I'd tossed in the garage trash like discarded hopes, here he was casually requesting $2,200 for Tommy's high school graduation party, as if our son's quiet disappointment hadn't registered on his radar at all. Treating the event like some grand family affair that demanded my contribution, despite the fact that he and his relatives had treated us like inconvenient afterthoughts for years. Ever since the divorce when he moved down to Cincinnati to start fresh with his new job and whatever distractions kept him from weekend visits. I turned off the faucet finally, drying my hands on the dish towel embroidered with a silly farm scene that my mom had sent last Christmas, and paced the linoleum floor replaying the audacity of his words in my head. How he phrased it so offhand, like we were still partners splitting costs on a joint vacation instead of estranged parents navigating custody and child support through lawyers who charged by the hour. And that specific amount hitting me like a poorly aimed soccer ball to the gut when I was already juggling mortgage payments and Ethan's braces fund on a salary that barely covered groceries without dipping into savings. All while his social media posts showed him posing with Tommy at baseball games or family barbecues that looked picture perfect from the outside. Settling at the table with a lukewarm cup of coffee that had gone bitter from sitting too long, I scrolled back through old messages from his family, spotting the patterns I'd half ignored before, like Evelyn's vague promises of visits that never materialized because of her bridge club commitments, or Karen's last-minute cancellations citing kid fevers that suspiciously aligned with nicer weather down south. Subtle snubs that painted a picture of selective affection where Tommy's milestones trumped Ethan's every time, and it dawned on me then, with a wry chuckle escaping my lips, that their version of family support was more like a one-way street paved with expectations but no reciprocity, the kind of setup that left single moms like me feeling like the villain for pointing it out. By the time Ethan wandered in asking if dinner could include extra mac and cheese to cheer things up, I mustered a smile and nodded, dishing out seconds while we chatted about his day at school where a friend had shared stories of a packed birthday sleepover. His eyes lighting up with that resilient spark kids have, but shadowed by the memory of our empty yard, and in that moment, sharing a quiet laugh over how we'd turned the party flop into our own private comedy by pretending the balloons were alien invaders that deflated from boredom, the humor lightening the load just enough to keep the evening from tipping into full melancholy. Energized by that small connection and my growing irritation at Mike's nerve, I pulled out my banking app later after Ethan was asleep, the house settling into its nighttime creaks. and transferred exactly $1 to the account he'd linked in past support disputes, attaching a note that read, "Best wishes for Tommy's big day. May it be as memorable as Ethan's was." Hitting confirm with a satisfying tap that felt like the first real pushback I'd mustered in months. A witty little gesture, loaded with sarcasm that I imagined would land like a splash of cold water on his entitled parade, clever enough to sting without escalating to the shouting matches that had defined our split. That act of defiance carried me through the next morning's rush, dropping Ethan off with promises of pizza night ahead, and by afternoon I'd swung by the hardware store on my break, picking up new deadbolts and chains for the doors because if they were going to treat our home like an optional stop on their social calendar, I might as well make it official by securing it against uninvited drama. Installing them that evening with a toolkit borrowed from the neighbor Mr. Miller, who chuckled at my determination and shared a story of his own family lockout years back, the metallic clicks of the mechanisms echoing through the hallway like declarations of independence, Ethan watching wide-eyed from the couch and asking if we were fortifying against pirates, which drew another shared giggle as I explained it was just grown-up precautions to keep things safe and ours. Testing the keys under the soft glow of the entry light with a sense of empowered finality washing over me, the kind that comes from reclaiming control in a life full of compromises, I finally exhaled deeply, picturing Mike's reaction if he ever tried waltzing in unannounced again, but that fleeting triumph shattered around 9 when the doorbell chimed insistently through the quiet house, sending a jolt straight to my chest. And peering through the fresh peephole I saw 2 police officers standing on the porch, their uniforms crisp under the floodlight and expressions neutral yet probing, one holding a clipboard as if ready to document whatever chaos Mike had spun this time to draw them to my door. Peering through the newly installed peephole at the 2 police officers standing on my porch that crisp autumn evening with the floodlight casting long shadows across the driveway and the neighborhood dogs barking faintly in the distance, my pulse quickened into a frantic rhythm as I wondered what fresh layer of nonsense Mike had layered on top of his money grab this time, especially after my $1 reply that I'd sent earlier with such a spark of defiant humor. So I took a steadying breath, smoothed down my sweater that still smelled faintly of the hardware store's metal polish, and swung the door open just wide enough to greet them politely while keeping the chain engaged as a subtle reminder of my newfound boundaries, their badges glinting under the light as the taller one explained they were there for a routine welfare check initiated by a concerned family member down in Cincinnati, who had reported possible instability in the home following a financial dispute involving a child, which immediately clicked into place as Mike's doing since his text about Tommy's party had arrived that very afternoon and my sarcastic response might have prompted him to spin it into something more dramatic to garner sympathy or leverage. Inviting them inside with a calm offer of coffee from the pot I'd brewed earlier to settle my nerves after the lock installation, I led them to the living room where Ethan's backpack lay open on the couch with textbooks spilling out like evidence of our ordinary routine. And as they settled on the worn armchairs that had seen better days from the divorce-era yard sales, I recounted the full context starting from Ethan's birthday party that no one from Mike's side had bothered to attend despite the invitations and promises, describing the deflated balloons sagging in the backyard like symbols of their indifference, and how Mike's subsequent request for $2,200 for his other son's graduation felt like a slap after. Ignoring our boy's special day, the officers nodding thoughtfully while jotting notes on their pad and asking gentle questions about Ethan's well-being and any recent stresses, which allowed me to show them his room upstairs with the posters of soccer stars and the half-finished model airplane on his desk, emphasizing how stable our life was despite the co-parenting hurdles that Mike had always exaggerated in court to paint me as the unreliable parent during those contentious hearings 2 years ago. By the time they finished their coffee and assured me the check was precautionary, but no red flags appeared, leaving with a business card and advice to document any further harassments, the clock had ticked past 10 and the house felt heavier with the residue of intrusion. But as their cruiser pulled away down the quiet street lined with maple trees shedding their leaves, a wave of indignation washed over me mingled with that wry amusement at the absurdity of Mike deploying the law like a petty weapon rather than just picking up the phone to hash it out like adults. The whole episode reeking of the manipulative tactics he'd pulled during our marriage when he'd guilt me into covering his bar tabs by claiming work bonuses were delayed or exaggerate small arguments to his family to position himself as the victim. The next morning over breakfast with Ethan chattering about a school art project inspired by autumn colors that mirrored the turning leaves outside our window, I pushed the police visit to the back of my mind and dove into sleuthing during my lunch break at the library, pulling up old bank statements on my laptop in the staff room where the hum of the vending machine provided white noise, spotting recurring patterns in Mike's financial pleas from before the split like those unexplained withdrawals around casino towns in Indiana that he dismissed as client lunches, and cross-referencing with public records online that hinted at a gambling habit he'd hidden by forging small documents to borrow against joint assets, the 2,200 figure suddenly seeming less like a party budget and more like a desperate patch for mounting debts that his family might be enabling under the guise of celebrating Tommy's milestone. Sharing the discoveries that evening with my friend Lisa over a quick phone call while folding laundry that smelled of Ethan's soccer cleats, she laughed in that supportive way about how Mike's crew operated like a well-oiled machine of selective blindness, suggesting I call him out subtly to avoid direct confrontation, which planted the seed for my next move as I logged into the old family Facebook group that evening after Ethan was tucked in with his night light glowing softly, posting a seemingly innocuous update with a photo of the empty picnic table from the party captioned, reflecting on what family really means, grateful for the quiet moments that build real bonds, even when plans fall flat, a witty jab disguised as introspection that exposed their no-show without accusations and drew immediate comments from mutual acquaintances expressing sympathy, while Mike's relatives stayed conspicuously silent. The online ripple feeling like a clever revenge that satisfied the itch for justice without dragging everything into the open mess of arguments. As notifications pinged through the night with likes and private messages from cousins admitting they'd heard about the event but faced family pressure to skip, I savored the small victory of cracking their facade just a bit. But that fragile peace shattered around midnight when my phone rang with Mike's number flashing insistently, his voice on the other end laced with fury as he demanded to know what I thought I was doing by airing dirty laundry online and warning that he'd make sure I regretted pushing him this far, the call cutting off abruptly with a threat hanging in the air like smoke from a backfiring engine, leaving me wide awake in the dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy spin and pondering just how deep his desperation ran and what escalation he had in mind next. Hanging up on Mike's heated call that midnight hour with the phone still warm in my hand and the bedroom shadows deepening from the moonlight filtering through half-drawn curtains, I lay there wide awake listening to the distant hum of a neighbor's late-night television while his parting threat echoed in my mind like a poorly tuned radio static, promising he'd ensure I regretted my online post and the $1 stunt, as if his own history of flakiness gave him any moral high ground in this escalating tangle of family obligations and financial manipulations. So by morning I shook off the unease with strong coffee and a resolve to document everything from the welfare check to his outburst in a notebook I'd started keeping after the divorce for just such custody skirmishes, dropping Ethan at school with extra hugs and a lighthearted story about how some grown-ups argue like kids over toys to mask the worry churning inside me about how his innocence might get caught in the crossfire if Mike decided to weaponize it further. The workday at the library dragged with stacks of returns that blurred into one another under the fluorescent lights, but during my afternoon break I checked the mailbox on the way home, pulling out a thick envelope marked certified mail from an attorney in Cincinnati, whose name I'd seen on Mike's side during our settlement. The letter inside outlining a demand for review of shared assets tied to the divorce decree and subtly threatening custody modifications if I didn't cooperate with what they called reasonable family contributions like the graduation fund, the legalese twisting my stomach into knots because it felt like another layer of his control game, using lawyers to bully when direct talk failed. And that evening, as I prepared spaghetti with meatballs that Ethan devoured while recounting his soccer practice goals, the dilemma hit me full force when he casually asked why Uncle Tommy's party needed money from us, but his birthday didn't get The same, forcing me to navigate the conversation with vague assurances about different family traditions while inwardly wrestling with whether shielding him from the ugly truths was kindness or just delaying the hurt. Knowing that my choices to push back might paint me as the divisive one in his eyes someday, the kind of mom who prioritized spite over unity even if those bonds had frayed long before under Mike's neglect. Confiding in Lisa later over a quick text exchange that devolved into voice notes filled with her empathetic rants about exes who treated alimony like a suggestion. She urged me to counter with something symbolic yet sharp to expose the hypocrisy without full-blown war, which inspired my next step the following weekend when a package arrived from Evelyn containing belated birthday trinkets for Ethan, like a generic stuffed bear and a card with check for $20 that screamed afterthought. So instead of handing it over, I bundled the items with a few others from past half-hearted gestures and donated them to the local children's shelter in Mike's name, enclosing a polite thank you letter to the charity that read, "From Michael Jenkins, honoring family support in tough times. May it bring joy to kids who need it most." Mailing copies to his family email chain with a note about spreading goodwill where it counted, the witty revenge landing with a clever twist that I hoped would irk him by turning his sparse generosity into public fodder for their social pretenses while satisfying my need for payback without stooping to outright confrontation. And sure enough, by Monday afternoon her voicemail arrived laced with flustered indignation about how I was twisting her kindness into something political, which drew a quiet chuckle from me over lunch as I pictured the discomfort rippling through their group chats. Yet that light victory soured midweek when the attorney's follow-up call came through on speaker while I was grading volunteer storytime feedback. The voice on the line pressing for immediate wire transfer to avoid escalation and hinting at Ethan's best interests in a way that made my blood run cold, prompting me to hang up and pace the empty reading nook with its shelves of well-loved picture books. The uncertainty gnawing at me like an unsolved puzzle where every piece seemed to point to Mike's deeper troubles, and that evening after tucking Ethan in with promises of a movie night soon to lift spirits, I sat at my desk scrolling through credit monitoring alerts I'd set up post-divorce, spotting an unfamiliar inquiry for a personal loan in my name linked to an address in Cincinnati that matched Mike's. The details fuzzy but screaming potential identity misuse from shared accounts we hadn't fully untangled, my hands trembling as I logged into the full report and confirmed the application date aligning suspiciously with his recent pleas. A twist that unveiled not just entitlement, but possible fraud to cover whatever holes his gambling or lifestyle choices had punched in his finances, leaving me staring at the screen in the lamplight with a flood of questions about how far his schemes extended and whether protecting our future meant choices that could shatter the fragile normalcy Ethan still clung to. The growing conflict pressing in like walls closing around our little world. Staring at the fraudulent loan alert on my computer screen that tense Friday evening with the house lights dimmed low and Ethan's laughter fading from the living room where he'd just finished a puzzle we'd assembled together over microwave popcorn to cap off a long week, the revelation hit me like a sudden downpour on a clear day, confirming that Mike's pleas for money weren't mere opportunism, but part of a calculated scheme to exploit lingering ties from our marriage by applying for credit in my name to patch up his mounting debts from what looked like a spiraling gambling habit based on the transaction patterns my financial contact had flagged during a hurried call that afternoon. So I closed the laptop with deliberate care to avoid startling Ethan and spent the night wide awake in bed piecing together the subtle clues that had built up over months, like his evasive texts about work bonuses that never materialized and the way his family circled wagons around Tommy's events while ours faded into footnotes, the uncertainty twisting into a resolve that no matter how tangled the ties, I couldn't let his shadows engulf the stability we'd carved out in this Ohio suburb with its familiar routines and quiet streets. The weekend unfolded in a haze of cautious preparation, consulting with a pro bono lawyer friend of Lisa's who reviewed the documents over video chat on Saturday morning while Ethan played outside, kicking his soccer ball against the garage door. Her expertise uncovering forged signatures linking the loan to Mike's Cincinnati address and suggesting it tied into broader fraud reports from similar victims in his circle, which painted a picture of desperation masked as family needs where the two $1,200 for Tommy's graduation was likely a cover for bailing out bookies rather than booking venues, and as we strategized next steps like freezing my accounts and filing complaints, I felt a mix of vindication and sorrow for the man I'd once built a life with, wondering if his choices stemmed from the stresses of our split or deeper flaws that his relatives had enabled through their selective blindness. By Sunday afternoon, with Ethan napping after a park outing where we'd skipped stones on the pond and shared stories of imaginary adventures to keep the mood light, the emotional weight pressed in as I reflected on how my pushbacks from the $1 wire to the charity donation might have accelerated his cornering, yet also forced the cracks wide enough for truth to seep through, leaving me to grapple with the dilemma of whether involving authorities would ultimately help Ethan heal from the neglect or just deepen the scars of a divided family that preached unity but practiced exclusion. The climax arrived unannounced on Monday evening just as the sun dipped behind the neighbor's roofline, casting golden hues through the kitchen windows where I was chopping vegetables for stir-fry, the doorbell ringing with an authoritative tone. That sent a familiar jolt through me, and peering out I saw the same two officers from the welfare check, now flanked by a third in plain clothes, their expressions grave yet reassuring as they identified themselves and requested entry to discuss an ongoing investigation, so I ushered them into the living room with Ethan safely upstairs on a video call with a school friend, where the lead officer laid out the details in measured tones about an arrest warrant issued for Mike on multiple counts of financial fraud, including the identity theft on my account that my bank report had triggered, explaining how tips from a disgruntled relative, possibly stirred by my online post and the charity stunt, had connected the dots to his gambling ring where he'd siphoned funds from ex-partners to cover losses, the $2,200 figure emerging as a specific payoff to avoid escalation from lenders who'd grown suspicious, as they described the raid on his apartment that morning yielding forged documents and ledgers tying back to our divorce papers. A wave of relief mingled with hollow triumph washed over me, the growing conflict resolving in handcuffs clicking far away, but leaving echoes of what-ifs about how his family's complicity might fracture further, and whether Ethan's grandparents would ever step up without the golden child to shield, prompting the officers to commend my documentation as key to the case while advising protective orders to safeguard our home. For my final act of closure, I drove to the station the next day during Ethan's school hours, the autumn leaves swirling in eddies along the interstate as I gripped the wheel with a blend of nerves and determination. And upon arrival in the sterile waiting area, I waited until Mike was brought out in orange scrubs for a pre-trial consult, handing him through the partition a single printed photo of our empty backyard from the party with deflated balloons in the foreground and a note attached, reading, "This is the family you built for us. Hope Tommy's day filled the voids better than this." My voice steady as I said it was the last word for me before changing all shared contacts and focusing on our son, walking out into the crisp air with a witty satisfaction that the gesture encapsulated years of slights without descending into rage. Yet as I slid into the car, the regret crept in like fog, questioning if my clever revenges had crossed into cruelty by denying Ethan potential reconciliation down the line, or if self-preservation demanded severing those toxic threads entirely. Weeks later, with the locks secure and legal shields in place, the house hummed with a tentative peace broken only by Ethan's questions about his dad's absence that I answered with honest but gentle truths about grown-up mistakes. Our evenings filled with board games and library story hours that rebuilt joy from the ground up, but the unanswered riddles lingered in quiet moments like whether Mike's pleas ever held a shred of genuine remorse or if his family's silence signaled deeper secrets still buried, leaving me to ponder amid the turning seasons if true revenge lay in thriving despite the betrayals or in the endless what-ifs that tested the heart's capacity for forgiveness in a world where family ties could bind as tightly as they strangled.